Paula Scher has paved the way for many striving designers, and especially she paved the way for women in graphic design. She was the first female partner at Pentagram, the seminal New York design consultancy. It is merely impossible to name all her works that have coined or recoined the way how we perceive the art of graphic design. In the following presentation, she will demonstrate to us the value of trust, the trust between a client and a designer, and how it can ultimately lead to a win-win situation. Apart from that, the video also features a cute woof-woof situation. Hello from Bielefeld to the US, and thank you for being with us.
This is a painting of Joe Papp, painted by an American illustrator named Paul Davis, probably in about 1970. Joe Papp was a theater producer, and he used to take Shakespeare plays and put actors and actresses in flatbed trucks and move them around New York City to various areas of the city and put on free Shakespeare outside. And he did this for a number of years in the 50s and the 60s. And then the government of New York City gave him the Delacorte Theater, where he could stage outdoor free Shakespeare for all of New York. There's been free Shakespeare in the park ever since. It's been around for about 60 years. In early 60s, I believe, he saved the Astor Library in New York City from destruction. This is a building that's downtown in an area called NoHo. And he turned it into a public place that would be a theater. And he called it the Public Theater. None of the press did. They called it the New York Shakespeare Festival because they connected it to the productions in the park, or they called it the Papp after Joe Papp. These are the sorts of plays Joe Papp put on. You'll see the two on the right were painted by Paul Davis, who painted all of the New York Shakespeare Festival posters until the late 80s, I believe. But he put on hit plays like Hair, and he remade things like Three Penny Opera, and he supported a lot of new dramatists and American actors who launched their careers there, like Meryl Streep and Kevin Kline. All came out of the Public Theater. At the point in time that I moved to New York, I became aware of the public, and at that time I was a record cover designer, and I worked for CBS Records, and I made lots of images that were sort of poster-like because they were on 12 by 12 surfaces. I even worked with Paul Davis, who I admired greatly. And then later I started my own business. In 1991, I joined an international design firm called Pentagram, and here I am, the only woman partner among 17 men. And I look at the picture now, and I don't even know how I did it. But at that particular point in time, one of the reasons I wanted to join Pentagram was I wanted to be able to work on larger scale projects. I was getting quite small, more promotional types of projects when I had my own firm in the 80s and never could make the jump to higher paying work that was more visible. So I calculated that if I joined this big group of men, it would be like joining the football team and I'd get bigger projects. But in that period of time, I was also intimidated by them and felt that I was insufficient because I hadn't done big visible identity programs. This is a picture of George C. Wolfe. He became the managing director of the Public Theater in 1994. And he wanted to change the identity. Joe Papp had died 2 years earlier, and attendance had dropped, and the idea of the public theater as a fresh place in New York City had waned, and he was going to breathe new life into it. He saw my work in a book called Graphic Design New York, in which he saw 2 images that looked like this. One of them was a poster for Elvis Costello, and the other was a great big piece of typography that was cut up. And he thought that this might be a way to cleanse the palette. In other words, he wanted to change the work from what people perceived as the public, which was Paul Davis's big posters that were obviously painted and illustrative. And he thought maybe we could use another form to change the look of the public. This is what theater advertising looked like back in the day when I began working on the public identity. And actually, a lot of it still looks like this today. It's actually a very mediocre area of design in New York City. Most Broadway plays, with few exceptions, are really very good. I took inspiration from the London theater community. I was in London a lot as a Pentagram partner, and I would walk around an area that's in the West End called Drury Lane, where I'd see buildings that had painted sides that had advertisements for theater promotions on there, and they were quite amazing. They were all in typography. They had the name of the person who was in the play itself, the date and the time, no cute pictures of cats, nothing like that. And at the same point in time, as I was looking at it, I found in that period of typography, in a book by Rob Roy Kelly, who wrote a book on American wood typography, this page that showed how letter forms were drawn in the same family from various weights and widths. And I looked at it and I thought this would be a good way to address the public theater's logo, because it could become representative of all of New York in the varying widths. So I put together this logo. It was designed in 1994 when I was hired. And at this point in time, none of this typography was digitized. It was all put together by hand from books and complete alphabets I had of wood type that I had since I worked at CBS Records. So I would Xerox this thing and my team would cut them up and paste them together, old style. We made tons of promotions, and it was released in New York City, and it became highly visible because there were so many handbills and things like that. But the way it was really seen were on these things that were phone kiosks that most of you, if you're in your 20s, probably have never seen. There's streets in New York that had pay telephones that ran down the block, and you would have a side of the telephone that had room for advertisements. So these public theater posters that I designed in the 90s were visible all the way up and down the streets of New York. Then I began making other posters for the theater where the play pushed what the content of the poster was. So Him was a play about Elvis, and The Diva is Dismissed was about a woman who stood up and screamed on stage for about 3 hours. And that's where the poster images came from. Sometimes they were more abstract. Sometimes they were very specific. And I had thought that these posters would appear in the phone kiosks or be out on the street. But in fact, they never were. The public theater really didn't have the money to pay for them. So the only place that these posters were seen was inside the public theater, with one exception. Designers knew them. And designers knew them because I entered them in design competitions and they got in, so that they were reproduced in design competitions all over the world. And people saw them. Some museums started to collect them. But the general public in New York City really had no idea what these things looked like. I was making them continually and frustrated by the fact that it was actually quite a limited audience that knew about this work I was doing. The things they did see were the summer posters. The summer posters were for 2 plays that appeared at the Delacorte Theater. And they were Shakespearean plays, and they were generally completely typographic because it was very difficult to make an image for 2 very different plays. So we would make up language for it, and it would be based on typography. These things were all over New York. They were in the phone kiosks, they were in the subways, they were in the train stations, and where most New Yorkers saw them was as full-page ads in the New York Times like this. So I would say for the first 5 years I was working for the public theater, what the public actually saw were these ads and not the other posters I showed you earlier. I also did the design for the public theater inside because it was a quick fix. We painted the walls white. We hung up a lot of banners and a lot of the graphics, and it sort of transformed what the inside of the theater looked like. And as a result of doing this work, I became an environmental graphic designer, and it opened up a whole new book of work where I ended up painting buildings and now really constructing things just based on hanging things up in one space in New York City. In 1996, this monster musical opened. It was called Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk. And this yellow poster, which may be the most famous, was actually a season poster. All the plays were on this poster. And the Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk was a tap rap musical. And so for the musical, we designed something loud and proud. And I did this very much through seeing Sadie and Glover dance at Pentagram. If you look at the poster on the left, that was the very first poster we did for this whole thing before we did the yellow one. And I began to establish the look of what this musical was. But if you look at the one on the right, the one on the left was shot by my partner, Peter Harrison. And the one on the right was shot by Richard Avedon because it got so fancy. Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk was a hit. It moved uptown to Broadway. And if you look at the posters, there'll be something that is very unusual for theater advertisements. There's no logo. The logo changed depending upon the design of the thing. Also, there's no public theater logo on the one on the right because it wasn't at the public theater. It was at the Ambassador Theater on Broadway. So when theater audiences and people began to see and read about this musical, it had left the downtown theater and it had moved uptown, and nobody knew that this was a public theater promotion, except for people who looked at design annuals. You wouldn't know it because the public was never credited in the myriad of things we made for it simply because it wasn't at that theater, and the theater that held the public had the right to have their logo on it. We began making all kinds of booklets for it, all kinds of promotions for it, and of course it was on Broadway, and you look at it again, and there's no public theater logo except for that little P in a circle. Nobody knew that it was playing there. It was on the sidewalk. It was on the sides of buildings. It was all along the street. And then this really peculiar thing began to happen. It stopped being the identity for the public altogether because people began imitating it. And this had never happened to me before, where a graphic was so pervasive that people started copying it. And it became a kind of vernacular. It became a language of a city, not an identity for a theater and not even an identity for a play. And this is really a terrible thing to happen to you if you're an identity designer because you've kind of failed. You've not really built up the place that this thing came from, but you've built up an attitude that's absorbed by other people, and you lose ownership over it. The first thing that happened was theater companies started ripping it off. This was an ad in the New York Times at the time that identity existed. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that one theater company would just blatantly rip off another. One of my students and friend used the wood type to promote Chicago, which had much more money than the public theater and was seen all over the place, much more than the public was. So it was as if the identity for this theater got eaten up. So I radically changed it. I did these posters right after 1998 at the pinnacle of Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk, because I wanted the public to have some identity. And I showed these things to my partner, my director, George Wolfe, and he said, "Oh God, Paul is turning 50. Let's have a year of depressing posters." And these things were out. Nobody remembers them. They really were wrong. And about 6 months later, I changed them and began changing the type every season. So I'd pick a typeface for the season, put them on posters that nobody saw, and then occasionally they would go to Broadway, like Type Dog Underdog, but people still wouldn't know it was part of the public. By the end of this period, George was already sick of managing the public theater. He'd been doing it for 8 years, and he wanted to go make films. And the sort of work I was doing was all over the place, and the public theater, essentially, with the exception of a logo, had no identity at all, even though people liked the posters, and they've still gotten to design competitions. This is Oscar Eustace. He took over the theater in about 2004. And he was very much in love with the idea of the theater in many ways from a different vantage point of George Wolfe. He wanted the theater to be opened up for all the people. He wanted the theater to be as broad-based as possible, and he wanted all kinds of programs and new theatrical ventures that would come out of the public that would be more important to a degree than the individual plays. The first thing he asked me to do was a 50th anniversary for the public. And I knew I couldn't change the public logo because it was recognizable. It was the only thing that was recognizable, actually. So I redrew it as Accidents Grotesque. Nobody ever knew I did this. This was the crazy thing of being able to make a graphic with that thick and thin that's so recognizable and completely change the font to something from a completely different era and period. And then we made all the typography Accidents Grotesque, and we did this for about 3 or 4 years. After a period of time, I got incredibly sick of it and thought it was a mistake. And during this period, there was a second person at the public who was a financial manager who had been brought in to help George Wolfe. And she locked horns with Oscar. And during that period, which I would say lasted about 1.5 years, everything got incredibly political. And this was the period that I had to do things 1,000,000 times because the two powers that were there were always knocking horns on what something should look like. After that ended, I began working with Oscar purely the way I worked with George Wolfe, and things got easier and the work got better. And I was still working with Accidents Grotesque, and we made this poster together, which I still love. And he asked me to lunch, and I thought, I guess he's going to fire me because he's a new director and he never got to build his own art department. And it seemed logical to me that he would tell me to take a walk. And we had lunch at a very, very, very nice Italian restaurant. And I remember going there thinking, why is he taking me to such a nice place to fire me? And he didn't. He said he really loved the public theater when I first did it. He said he loved it when he first saw it in New York. And he'd like me to find a way of revisiting it and finding a way to make it function for all the small space advertising they had to do and to be its own spirit. So I was totally delighted, and I took out a lot of what made the public interesting because I had to design things that would work largely in black and white in newspaper advertising. So I designed this sort of fairly constructivist formatted kind of design, and they were designed for specific programs as well as the plays. So there would be something specific for Under the Radar, and there would be a seasonal book. And then the play itself would have its own poster, and this is the only time I could actually do 2 plays as an illustration because it was Hamlet and Hare. And that was, in all the 25 years I've been able to do the Shakespeare in the Park, I've never been able to do an image again. But then the next season, I did something similar and determined that it was completely boring, and I realized I'd made a complete mistake with this identity. So I tried to grow it, and I used the plays that nobody saw anyway to see what happened with color and to see if it had what I call legs, meaning it's expandable and becomes interesting. And I found myself running up against the same old problem. You could see these things small in the newspaper and they worked well, but really after a period of time, you didn't recognize them. The summer posters worked better, and people still didn't recognize the totality of the public theater. There just wasn't enough money to do it. Later in the decade, about 2008, they put me on the board of the public, actually before then, and they put me on the building committee because we were going to redo the lobby. And it was sort of a payment to me because they didn't pay me very much to do this work and they wanted me to stay, so they thought I'd be honored by being on the board. But I went on the board meetings and I actually found them boring and I didn't want to do it. And then I found out I couldn't even design the graphics in the lobby because the city gave the public theater money and it would be a conflict of interest. So I resigned the board to work on the lobby, and I'm so glad I did because it's there forever. We built a new awning for it. I did this with the architect James Polshek, who remained a lifelong friend after that. And we customized the lobby with a chandelier that played all of Shakespeare's plays and a customized desk and all the typography forever indelibly put into the walls and permanent signage in the whole place. The banners were gone, and it became a sea of typography and donors' walls. And then we took all the plays, or most of the plays that I'd worked on the past 20 years, 10 years, however long it was, and we put them behind the box office, sort of sniped on walls, and we changed them from time to time. And when I saw this, I knew what I had been doing wrong for all these years, and that it was that I was seeing these individual images as things that the public would see when they couldn't possibly see them, and that this not-for-profit theater would never have the kind of money that something like Nike has. It would never be the kind of advertising campaign where everybody would see everything at once. And I would really have to rethink how I thought about things. It happened that season, we did more of an advertising campaign for the public because we were opening the new lobby. And we bought, this was the last phone kiosk I think that we ever did. We bought a lot more advertising for it that lived out in public space and in subways. And people began to see it. They knew the lobby was open. The problem was I would never have this freedom to have this purchased in any other place but the summer programs. And I wondered, how can I get a maximum impact out of these graphics I'm designing? And then one summer, when we were doing our normal Shakespeare in the Park promotions, I thought, what if we take this thing, this graphic, and we extend it so we use it on Joe's Pub, the cabaret next door to the public, and then we use it as signage for the theater itself, and when you go to the Delacour Theater, and we began to create all of these pieces based on this graphic. The next year, I decided that everything should be the graphics that come from the summer season, whatever the plays are. So I began to figure out how these posters I was making become manuals. And I realized, well, you could probably build an in-house art department and you could have them work with the season graphics, and therefore they could make everything consistent that way, and you could change it every year. So there was a woman who was my student who was working for me at Pentagram named Kirsten Uber, and I sent her down to the public, and we worked on this particular poster together. And then we did the signs, and she took them over and knew how to do it because she understood the design. And then we did everything we could possibly make through that summer in this design, and then made a decision that for the rest of the season, we would simply flop the colors of the posters and create a look where all posters were sort of the same and all promotions for the public were the same. So we kind of made a little manual out of how the color worked and what the rules were on photography and how you used it. And we began to create these season posters. And this was the first season we did. The second season, we got more rigorous and kept them more similar, even though we changed the color green. And did the signage as we did before, and then this is the way the season looked. And if you read the posters, you'll notice in the black one, if you go about 4 items down, you'll see a little play called Hamilton, which was a mega hit but we didn't promote it any more than we promoted any of the other things. It went to Broadway. It had its own life on Broadway. They used a different graphic for it. It's a different theater, because the public theater really wasn't about being on Broadway. It's about being on downtown and developing these items that go to Broadway. And Broadway can do whatever it wants. So what began to happen is that people started noticing the seasons, not the plays. And what happened as a result of it is that the membership of the public went way up, because they saw it as one place that does the specific thing, that has all these programs that they would want to go and see the plays of a season. And if they bought a season pass, they'd be in a better position to go see them. And it's been like this ever since. In doing this, I really didn't know what the economic result would be about it for the theater, but I knew that I would begin to make some headway in getting to New Yorkers to connect these sorts of graphics with this sort of place and let them have ownership over it, which they had lost during Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk. And that is a terrible thing to happen to a designer who's really doing another job. I mean, typography is my medium here, but if everybody takes the language and uses it, the place has no identity of its own. And that was really a huge lesson to learn. The staff, we began to grow the staff downtown, and they are fantastic. The season starts with me beginning to figure out what the language will be. And the next year it was slashing through typography. And the first notion was, first we'll slash through typography because it's the summer poster and it doesn't have any images. And you'll slash through signage. But then, of course, you're slashing through photography, and you can slash through any form, and it became recognizable. And what's interesting when we build these things is there's trial and error, because there's a moment where something deviates too far from the norm where you don't recognize it as the same thing. And there are 4 different people working on these at the same time. So I'm and they send them to me, they're like, they'll send me a PDF and I'm looking at it on my iPhone, and I'm just sort of calling them up and saying, move it a little to the left or close up the spacing here and there. But generally, they're spot on. There's a little bit of a learning curve at the beginning of the season, and they come up to Pentagram, and we sort of do a little tutorial until they get how to do it, and then we just roll them up, and just at the point everybody's sick of them, they go away. If you saw the film Abstract, I was working on this with Kirsten Huber, who I mentioned before, who's now come back to work for me, by the way, and I'm delighted. And we were inventing this one. And around this time, I found out that the people at the public, the actors, the actresses, the producers, the directors, the PR people, they name these seasons. Like this one was the bubble one. The one before was the slashy one. There was the zigzag one. And that the actors and actresses say when they talk to each other, what season were you at? Oh, I was in the slashy season. I did Shakespeare in the Park that year. And I thought, oh my God, this thing has worked. Here, this one is a signage. I'm taking you through them. And it was this season, not particularly one of my favorites, where I knew I had finally succeeded, because in this instance, the public had put on a play of Julius Caesar at the Delacorte Theater in the park. And Julius Caesar looked like Donald Trump in the play, and it was deliberate, and it had political overtones. And, the Trump organization condemned New York City because it gave funding to the public theater, and certain other papers condemned it. And then Delta Airlines, which sponsored the public theater, withdrew its sponsorship. And this was, like a big cause celeb. Then JetBlue came in and took the Delta sponsorship. And there was sort of a little left and war battle over these promotions and things. And this is what the season looked like. And then when they finally did the story about what had happened in the park, this is the cover of the Daily News in New York City, and sort of a trashy newspaper, and they didn't show a picture of an actor. They didn't show a picture of an actress. They didn't show a picture of the director. They didn't show even a picture of the building. They showed the poster. And that at that moment in time, I know I had finally broken through. So now We do them season by season, looking to reinvent. This year is the first season the posters didn't go up because of COVID. The plays in the park were canceled. But if you go online, you'll see a very vibrant public. It's not in this show and not in my book because it was done after the 25 years. But this thing lives on. I'm reinventing it each year. It's always done with knockout, which was based on the American wood type I began working with by hand originally. Design knockout is put out by Jonathan Heffler. And he actually tweets these every year because he wants to see what I'm going to do with his font. It is the best job a designer could have. And that, for me, the public theater was really my research and development. Years ago, one of my partners said to me that all businesses that invent something spend a quarter of their profits on research and development, and designers never do. But the public theater was my research and development. I learned more about typography and more about identity design doing this one project for 25 years while I did a lot of other things. And it was an amazing experience that I'm still living through, that I still love, that I still am inspired by. I'm really glad I did it, and I think it made me a better designer. Because as an identity designer, we all tell a little bit of a lie. We say, oh, we know how we can make you seen and noticed and recognized, and this thing can last very long periods of time. And of course, we don't really know what we're talking about, because there was no way I could have estimated that the world would really be seeing this stuff on Instagram when I first designed it in 1994. And that we kind of have to live these things to know how they can survive. So I wrote a book about it. It's called 25 Years of the Public. You saw most of it, but it tells you some more details. And that was my experience. Thank you very much.